Well, I'm very pleased to be talking today with Torsten Reimer. Torsten is a university librarian at the University of Chicago, but was born in Germany and spent several years working in the United Kingdom. So he has a fascinating background covering several different national systems. So welcome to the ATG podcast, Torsten.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for making time for me today.
So let's begin with a bit about that wonderful exotic background. I believe you studied as a historian, and you studied British maritime power. How did you? What appealed to you about British history?
Yeah, that question really takes me back. I mean, when I was a graduate student, I often got that question, and in some ways, at the time, it always surprised me because I thought, well, if you're a German, does it mean you should only study German history? I was really attracted to this because I felt the question of sort of the origins of British sea power and really the global impact that it had through the British Empire and in many other ways was one that has influenced history really broadly and in some ways arguably influences us today. Part of my interest in this, I think, came from being an Anglophile. Part of it was that many of my peers in the early modern area of the history department in Munich studied constitutional history of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. And while I find many historic aspects of early modern history interesting, that was really not a direction that I wanted to go down. But there was arguably for me, I think, a wider issue that drew me into this. And I think it's one that is relevant to talk a little bit longer about because I think really speaks to a lot about libraries in this. I didn't really set out to study maritime history as such. I became really interested in how the English and then later British thought of themselves as a maritime power and what that meant. So I started out studying a bit of the actual history and then found that how that history had been represented over the centuries afterwards was very different to what I found in the textbooks. And also there was a lot of discrepancies. I remember seeing all these films about English pirates and swashbucklers and about the history of the Spanish Armada. And looking at the history books, looking at the sources, I found something that was very different. And I then started asking myself the question, how did we end up remembering something so differently to what modern historical research tells us? And in the end, what I then found and what I tracked through my PhD over several years is that in the moment when history happens, the way how we talk about it shapes how it's perceived later. And I was tracking a process that ran over several centuries. I sort of looked at the time from 1480 to 1760. 1480 when print arrived in England, and 1740 when Rule Britannia was first performed. And that, I think, song, even though it has many other strands that leads into it, I think encapsulates a lot about how we currently think about British sea power, even though England for a long time was not the predominant maritime power. That was the French or the Spanish or the Portuguese or even the Dutch. And yet, in retrospect, we think of the country and the nation in that way. And so I traced public discourse, but then also how historians later picked up the public discourse, what different groups instrumentalized what happened and tried to instrumentalize memory to make claims about what it always had meant to be English. And I found that almost all of these were always driven by a current political agenda at the time. And it was really insightful, and it also gave me a great opportunity to spend several years in mostly libraries, but also archives in the UK and some of the wonderful libraries in Germany to really get to the bottom of this and develop an understanding of how national identity is created over time, and that it's an active process, and that involves choices that we make, and it involves propaganda, and it involves pressure groups and people of interests that, at least from my perspective at the time, are not always sort of benign or neutral, but in some cases are very much about control or power, instrumentalizing language and others, and instrumentalizing memory. And I think that really brings it back to a question that's really important about the role of the archive and the library in national identity, because it can be a source of national identity, but it can also be a tool to critique narratives that happen and critique people in power trying to use their interpretation of history to push the agendas that they have. And it's, I think, highlighted to me in some ways how important even today libraries can be. I lived in England during Brexit, and a lot of the rhetoric I could trace back to the early modern period that I'd looked at. And early on, I told my friends, I'm concerned Brexit might happen because it uses powerful language of national identity that needs to be countered with something else. And there wasn't anything as emotional and not anything that was sort of rooted in national identity. And so it was a really interesting piece of research. It spoke to my interest, I think, in English and British culture, and had this global reach that I found interesting. But it really, I think, ultimately highlighted a lot to me about the importance of memory and archives and libraries. And quite frankly, we see even today how authoritarian rulers in different countries try to suppress archives and libraries, because I think they understand that in a similar way as I do, just from a very different perspective.
Goodness me, that contrast between what happened and how people perceive what happened, that's a theme which has repercussions in pretty much every one of the countries you've been involved with. So you after several years immersing yourself in the in British archives, you clearly hadn't lost your taste for things British, because you ended up working in Britain. I think you started off working for JISC, the Organisation for Technology in Education.
Well, I first actually worked at King's College, but JISC at the time was partly hosted by King's College. So I spent a while in the center, and then it was later became the Department for Digital Humanities. Mostly, I think, working with digital scholars on digital research methods in the UK, but also internationally. And from there on, then transitioned over to JISC, who, for those of your listeners not so familiar with it, in many ways is a provider of digital infrastructure services for higher education and libraries. But at the time in particular also ran a research program that had a strong focus on sort of more speculative approaches. And I had an opportunity to run JISC's research infrastructure program, thinking about how cloud computing could be used for research, and working on a whole host of digital research tools, social media analysis that was new. And that was a very exciting time where I think I learned a lot about the potential of digital infrastructure to enable really exciting research.
And following JISC, you then moved full-time to a full-time library position, I believe.
In a sort of staged process. From JISC on, I moved to Imperial College, where I wasn't technically in the library. I was based in the research office, but with a fairly broad remit to coordinate work across the university to build open access infrastructure and services, and also research data services. And I did a lot of work in the library at that time, working very closely with the library director, Chris Banks, who just retired, and others at the library. And that in many ways, I think, sort of brought me back to the start of my career, where I not only spent time in libraries doing research, but also working in the State Library in Munich, which is a stellar library that very early on, I think, put a lot of resource into digitization and digital projects. And we had an ongoing partnership between the university and the library. So working again closely with the library at Imperial College, I think, connected me to the earlier start of my career. And at the time then, a senior position came up at the British Library, and I jumped to the opportunity because it's a wonderful library with great collections, but it also does a lot more. And at the time, I think I joined the British Library not only, but partly also to think about how the library could benefit more from technology in its research mission and how it could support digital research more broadly.
Well, the technology I think, has been a persistent strand in your career roles. But back to the British Library for a moment. Your title was Head of Research. So what does the Head of Research do at the British Library?
Well, it evolved in a sense. It was first Head of Research Services and then expanded to become Head of Content and Research Services. I think originally I started in particular with the focus of developing a strategy on how the British Library supports research, and then working with colleagues across the institution to implement that. The teams that I oversaw, I think, included a sort of small digital unit that did a lot of innovation-focused work on research infrastructure, repositories, research data, persistent identifiers, where the British Library has been active for a very long time, being one of the co-founders of DataCite. At the time, I also joined the board at DataCite that I very recently stepped down from. But also my team at the time included what in a university library you might describe as the subject librarians, colleagues who in particular were focused on licensing and procuring electronic resources. But initially the bulk of my work really was on the strategy and saying, how can we pull together all these different threads and have a forward-looking agenda and vision and a plan on how the British Library evolves and changes its research services, partly recognizing that one of the most important research services for the British Library for a long time has been its document supply service. Mm-hmm. That is one that is also, in a way, enshrined in law. If you look at the British Library Act, it says the British Library has to run an effective photocopying service, I think is the language used. That was the technology at the time. And that was really crucial in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but obviously shifted a lot. And that change, I think, in part was one of the reasons why the British Library said we need to think more broadly. Over time, though, my remit sort of expanded and also included all the sort of contemporary acquisitions of the library, managing of legal deposit, and my teams effectively processed all the content that came into the British Library, which at this time, both still in print, but also in digital, is very extensive. So over time, I expanded much more into also operationally running of a large research library. And that's been really crucial knowledge and expertise that helped me a lot in making the step over in my current role, being responsible for all aspects of a university library system.
Yes, so you then moved to Chicago, and it must have been a great contrast going from a national library to an individual institution, and also going from one country to another in a very, very different system. It must have been a bit of a shock.
Interestingly, in a way, I didn't really experience it that way. Partly, I think what helped is having already made that transition once, going from Germany to the UK. I mean, I would say on a spectrum, as much as you maybe don't really do a country justice, I think the UK is culturally in many ways closer to Germany and Europe, even though it may sometimes not perceive itself that way. And the US is notably more different. But I think what I found on the two occasions when I've changed country now, a lot of certainly the experience at work, I think links to the organizational culture. I remember in particular German friends and former colleagues sometimes asked me how I sort of found that transition. And I, in some cases, actually found the transition between different institutions was more striking in a work context. Research libraries, at least in the countries that I worked in, have, I think, a very similar ethos. It's about serving people. It's about being sort of inclusive. It's maybe in some ways focused a bit more on preserving things than on changing the status quo. And I think that probably comes from being organizations where preserving is one of the key missions. Libraries are very collaborative and generally inclusive and welcoming spaces. That's how I've always experienced them. And so for me, in some ways, changes in organizational culture in work have been more striking than I think the changes. I mean, to maybe explain this in some ways a bit more, we often have this perception that the United States do maybe not have that much bureaucracy, that in particular, everything that sort of involves personnel matters, there are fewer protections here, that you could be fired at a moment's notice. And that may be true in some ways, but it doesn't really reflect, even at a private institution, how libraries and how universities are run. There are so many similarities culturally. and in the policies and processes, irrespective of what the law says. I think anyone who feels at home in a UK research library could come to the University of Chicago Library and would not find it a striking difference. There are some differences, for sure, but I experience them somewhat more in life. And even here, I think one key thing one needs to remember making comparisons: the United States is a vast country.
One interesting aspect of the University of Chicago is that some university libraries run the publishing operation within the library, but I think the University of Chicago Press is separate.
Yes, this is true. And it's, I think, also partly, it has to, obviously, to do with the history of any organization, of how it's organized, but a key factor is also the size. Many university presses are smaller than libraries. At the University of Chicago, you could make the case that the press is larger than the library. Our press is the largest academic press in North America, I believe, and one of the largest globally. It's a very significant operation, and it also publishes a lot of content on behalf of other institutions, which again is, I think, different to many university libraries, although I appreciate, looking at the UK, you have Oxford and Cambridge that stand out in many ways. So we are both part of the portfolio of the provost here at the University of Chicago, and so we're collaborating. I am, in fact, an ex officio member of the board of the press, and the director of the board is of the press is also an ex officio member of the board of the library. So we are linked, but we are separate organizations, and I think partly this has to do with the size and scope of the operation.
You talked about similarities between the research libraries, and perhaps this is a theme for the next question. You talked about how for a national library, the connection can never be the entirety of available content these days. There's so much more content available that the library can never collect it. Surely the same must be true, even more so, for a single scholarly institution.
Yes, I mean, very much so. Now, what I should say, there are some interesting differences looking at, say, private institutions in the US. Some of the really prestigious, long-standing and well-funded private institutions have over a long time invested a lot of money in their collections. And the size of the collection, in particular monographs and journals at sort of leading private institutions here, are often significantly larger than those in the UK or in Germany. We have private institutions here that I wouldn't say could rival the totality of the British Library's collection, but in certain areas can rival and sometimes even surpass them. So we have a really extensive collection here, just picking maybe the most easily quantifiable part, with well over 13 million volumes. That's sizable, even, and in fact bigger than many national libraries in terms of what we hold here. And managing a collection of that size comes with its own challenges. Also, I think the large private institutions here have larger acquisitions budgets than many institutions in the UK. The acquisitions budget that I'm responsible here is significantly larger than that of the British Library. But obviously you can't exactly compare it, because the British Library, in principle at least, receives a copy of everything published in the UK, and given the UK's sizable publishing output, that alone is substantial. But the fact of the matter is that was true for the British Library. It will be true for the Library of Congress or Harvard, which I believe holds the largest library in private ownership anywhere in the world. That even these kinds of operations have to be focused. We cannot acquire anything. We cannot even acquire anything, everything in the areas that our faculty and students do research on. And like any collecting organization, we have to make choices about what we do. In these choices, I think, obviously, also then shift how people use our organizations, and in some ways also shift how our current past will be remembered in the future, because that's linked to what we can leave behind. We can address some of this through partnerships. That is something that I think was important for the British Library while I was there, and certainly important for the University of Chicago Library. We are the only library in the United States that's part of both the Ivy Plus Libraries Confederation and the Big Ten Academic Alliance. I think Ivy Plus Libraries Confederation will probably explain itself relatively easily. It's a network of the libraries of the Ivy and Ivy-like institutions. So the plus stands for institutions like, say, Stanford, MIT, and University of Chicago. The Big Ten Academic Alliance is an organization that originally came out of universities coming together and playing sports together. This, I think, from a European perspective, sounds a bit strange. And the University of Chicago was a founder in this, and until it decided to abolish some of its sports activities as not scholarly enough. Going back to culture, maybe I should, as a quick, if I may, excursion, say, even though I come from a family where football or soccer, as I now have to say, was really important, I was never that interested in it. And I'm now overseeing a library that was built on the space where the university previously had its stadium. The university at some point decided to get out of college football, eventually tore down its stadium and built its central library facility on it. That's an approach that I feel very much aligned to, and in some ways maybe closer to if I ended up at an institution that's very strongly based in its culture around football, which obviously for many institutions is important. But anyway, going back, the Big Ten Academic Alliance is a group of universities that play sports together, but they also collaborate on a range of initiatives, including the libraries work together. And there's now quite a few of us that together control a sizable amount of North American library budgets and collections. Some very big institutions like Ohio State, UCLA, University of Michigan are involved. And we have made a commitment that we want to treat our collections as one. In practical terms, that means any UChicago scholar can go to any other libraries and receives the same privileges and access that faculty would receive there. And we are slowly, given the complexity of this, but really working to the idea, how can we be more, not just more inclusive overall, but also more comprehensive by joining forces and saying effectively, if we share everything as one collection, and we can make much more material available for our researchers. So these are, I think, some of the challenges, but also some of the approaches that we are taking, partly to reduce cost, but also partly to broaden the amount of material that we can make available and preserve.
You talked about technology, and this is a good moment to introduce interoperable technology, because you've been a great advocate of persistent identifiers and open citations, and do you think this is something that an individual library like Chicago can be involved with?
Absolutely, and I mean, we support a range of these initiatives at the university. I think persistent identifiers ultimately only work if they're broadly used. Like any technology, however wonderful it is, if not enough people using it, it's not going to be effective. And this is especially true for technologies that are there to link information and people. So we are embedding persistent identifiers in our data, in the work that we do, our digital infrastructure. We promote them to faculty, and we also work with institutions like DataCite and others to support them. One of my colleagues, after I stepped down, has now joined the DataCite board, and we, in a way similar to other institutions who've been active in this space, we support a range of not just persistent identifier activities, but general not-for-profits and collaborative efforts, because we think, and this is a core part of our new strategy that we recently launched, we don't see ourselves as an island. We think that libraries, in particular academic libraries, need to be, I think, interfaces for their institutions into a global knowledge environment. And the way I sometimes talk about this to our faculty is that the classic idea of an academic library is it purchases or licenses, in whatever way, procures knowledge. In the past, that was embodied in manuscripts or books or CD-ROMs. Now it's content that we license and brings that into the community that it serves. That is a core function of libraries, and I think will be for a long time. But we're now also increasingly helping knowledge to flow within our organization and flow out of the university into the world. And that means providing persistent identifiers for our faculty, providing repository services, data management services, support for open access publishing, and broadly speaking, I think different bits of glue that make all these things play together. And therefore, we really have to think of the library as an interface for information to flow in and out. And that means you have to have a view and an engagement and support core technologies that are required to make this happen. In particular, I mean, publishing something online is easy. Everyone can do it. Maybe not for petabyte scale data sets, although if your credit card is big enough, that's not that difficult either. But do it in a way where people can find and access and reuse the information, and where you have some realistic hope that it's going to be there in 3 years, or as an early modern historian, I would hope 500 years. That's much more complex. And so a key role, I think, of libraries is also providing infrastructure in partnership for a global knowledge environment. That is something that I honestly feel every research library needs to be involved in to an extent. And it's a crucial part of our mission and vision, considering that we are the research library of a global research institution that wants to have and has had since its inception global impact. And I think that's also an encouragement for a library like ours to say, like our host institution, we want to make global impact that makes people's lives better through knowledge. That is the original Latin motto of the University of Chicago, loosely translated to improving lives through knowledge. And I couldn't think of a better motto for a research library as well.
Sounds great, but how would such a digital digital access be provided, sort of interoperable across all these institutions?
Yeah, that is a challenge. It's particularly a challenge because a lot of library infrastructure is aging and is not set up particularly well. So individually, I think we all need to get our house in order, or maybe I shouldn't say all. There will well be some libraries, depending on their history, who can fully engage in this. But overall, my experience is most libraries, even well-funded, prestigious ones, they have digitized content in the 1990s or 2000s that sits on maybe even the same technology that it was hosted at the time, partly because sometimes we have not kept the content and the infrastructure fully separate. And so migrating it's not very easy. So I think an important step that libraries should take, and many have been working on this for a while, is finding better and sustainable ways of exposing their content. We are doing this currently with help from the National Endowment of the Humanities. We've launched a project that we call UChicago Node. The idea is that the library will, for the first time, bring all the content that it can legally expose freely on the internet together on one platform. I deliberately don't say one system. It's not as simple as putting everything into one system. It's a range of technologies, several open technologies that we're using for this. And embed persistent identifiers and have technical interfaces that both humans and machines can link to that content and integrate it. And we're calling this UChicago Node, I think, for two reasons. Partly because the University of Chicago is a very distributed institution where every dean, every division has a lot of autonomy. So we were not envisaging that we would take all the content of the university. Rather, we work in partnership with academic units. We started this with the Humanities Division. We're now looking at bringing in the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, and we're talking to others, where we provide that core bit of technology through which the content can be exposed. We also offer hosting and preservation for those partners who want to trust us with their content, but they don't have to. They can keep material on their end, but we're integrating the metadata in a way that that material can be exposed through the central platform. That gives us a lot of flexibility because you can set up something bespoke, but as long as the content is stored in a standards compliant way and the metadata is exposed centrally, then when at some point that bespoke technology is no longer needed or can no longer support it, you can just switch it off, but the content remains accessible through the library. So we're building a central hub at the library, and then we have linked nodes in different parts of the institution. But we also called it Node because we see it as a node in a global knowledge system. So we are working towards exposing more and eventually all of our content in a standards compliant way using persistent identifier. We're also deploying a linked data technology to make this happen, and we're using existing approaches to metadata, in particular looking at Europeana, because we bring together a lot of diverse cultural heritage content, and so we thought we'd just reuse something that is used at scale.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a concrete contribution that we are making for our content, but we're also working in partnership through not-for-profit institutions and by supporting collaborative infrastructure to strengthen the ability of other libraries and archives to also connect their content in the same way.
Very impressive that you started, I understand, with the humanities. Most initiatives in sharing data and metadata start with STEM and ignore the humanities. So, do you think that's due to your humanities background?
Not really. Although, I mean, it might have played a way, but there is a bit of history in that the humanities division here has been for a long time running a set of, for simplicity's sake, I'm calling them digital modeling tools, although they do a lot more. It's for those listeners who want to look into it, it's the OCA data service. That's been developed here, but it's also used by humanities scholars and other institutions and countries. And that technology is developed and managed by the humanities division, but is hosted on library servers, has been for a long time. And we have integrated some of that technology into our platform. So they do some of, say, the metadata processing for us. And that makes it very easy for humanities content to flow through into our preservation and access system, but also means we didn't have to develop all of this from scratch and could reuse some of that technology. So we formed that partnership because there was an existing partnership, because we have forward-looking colleagues in the humanities division who are supportive of this, and also because there was a call from the NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, a rare one for supporting digital infrastructure and not research, which we thought was a good fit. We're supporting the sciences as well, but we've so far taken a more traditional approach by doing this through a repository and providing persistent identifiers. And we're now looking at bringing all of these things together that ultimately, at least from an external point of view, we can point users and say, if you're interested in the rich scholarly output of the University of Chicago or its collections, here's a place where you can go. But we have, in some way, similar partnerships. We currently in the process of launching a 5 petabyte data store together with the Research Computing Center, based on a grant from the National Science Foundation. That's an interdisciplinary set of researchers who are using this, but it's very strongly anchored in the Physical Sciences division at the University of Chicago. So we are expanding all of these partnerships in parallel. We just were lucky to a degree and hopefully also purposeful enough to get what for humanities level was a relatively large grant from the NEH that allowed us to do a lot of the foundation building. And we can then build on that, and we can also build on that by building other technologies, including increasing work that we do also with partners in the Data Science Institute and computer science to think about applications of artificial intelligence.
I was going to ask you more general questions about the role of the library, and referring to an article you wrote in 2018 called The Once and Future Library, where you asked, how can we, that is libraries, add value? But I think you've answered that one quite effectively. In fact, so much so that you described these wide-ranging functions that I think many of us were not aware of. Do you think it's a misnomer to call it a library these days?
I mostly know, because I think libraries have always been more than just buildings full of books and manuscripts. I mean, libraries are places to engage with and to create knowledge, and also spaces to connect with others and find support. And at any moment in time, libraries have, I think, followed that mission in different ways, and we do that today. So in many ways, I think, no, it's not a misnomer. But it is true, I think, that I find libraries sometimes narrows the conversation. I notice in particular part of my role here is fundraising. And that means I spend a lot of time in alumni relations and development works, and often find that the first step of the conversation is to widen the view and say, we do more than just books and journal subscriptions. And in particular, say, when I speak to alumni who've maybe studied here in the 1970s or 80s, a lot has changed. So I don't call it a misnomer, but I think it places a certain responsibility and task on us to be advocates for the institutions that we lead and that we work in, and to help people understand the wider context. And we talked about a few things that libraries do, but I can just quickly throw a few more in. We support student well-being here. We have students who almost literally, it feels, live in this library, and we create spaces and support for them to take a step back, don't study from 8 in the morning until midnight or longer, and manage your mental and physical health and well-being. We have a clinical librarian in this library who, as part of the hospital system, follows clinicians on their rounds when they see patients. And when they come across an interesting problem, my colleague Caitlin will then do some research and provide additional information that then the medical team can use for treating that patient. We have a geographical information systems librarian who provides training and support for students who deal with and engage all sorts of geographical reasoning-based questions. We work closely with faculty and units at the university in the area. We play, I think, an increasingly prominent role linked to AI and data infrastructures at the university, and then do a whole host of other activities. And I think it's on us to make that visible and to explain it. And a colleague recently, I think, suggested maybe we should name ourselves into the division for knowledge management, and I think she had some other ideas. I'm not sure we're going to do this, and we are anyway an institution that's recognized in the statutes of the university with that name. So would I want to change the name at this point? No. I think we should widen the process, but I would also say what I've often encountered is many people feel a strong love for libraries. That is partly what engages us with the alumni community, that they had really formative experiences here. Many people are fond of their public libraries. And if we were to change the name, I think we would lose that fondness and that attachment and that link to other libraries. So at this point, I think let's keep calling ourselves libraries. Let's just remind people that being a library now is a different thing than what it was 30 years ago, and can be a wonderfully diverse thing in terms of what it does. And it's almost certainly going to be a different thing again 20 years from now.
Do you think the library schools have kept up with these this vast range of new activities for the libraries? I've heard that many university libraries today don't require a library degree for new staff. Do you look for a library degree in your new hirings?
We do and we don't. It depends on the role. I mean, first of all, let me maybe say I value the time and effort that people put into their degree. I don't want to say degrees do not have value. I think they absolutely have value. I am of the view, though, and I know for some people that's controversial, that it depends on the role and the requirements of the role. I think we should not confuse skills and experience with a degree. There are other ways of getting relevant skills and experience, and we have some areas where we recruit where libraries globally would struggle to fill these positions if we would limit these roles only to people who have a master's in library information science. And I've had some discussions in the past with library schools, and they rightly point out that when research libraries come to them and say, we need graduates that are trained in open access, in data management, in GIS and artificial intelligence, that they also have school libraries who come to them and say, we do not need training in research data. Library schools have to cover a very broad field, and some approach this differently. There are library schools I think that do a terrific job, and we are delighted to hire their graduates. But we also recognize that in some areas, maybe the right mix is not available. So I think it's important that, in particular in areas where artificial intelligence, where the development just is faster than the degrees can be, or in some areas where we need in-depth knowledge that a one-year degree or even a two-year master's in library science could just not give you. I would not want to close the door to someone who has worked for years in that area in libraries, and I am an example of that. I do not have a master's in library science, but I've spent 25 years working with libraries or in library adjacent areas. And I hope I have some useful skills and experience still to offer. So it's important that we recognize and celebrate those of our colleagues who have those degrees, and there will be positions where I think that degree is absolutely required and is essential. And there are other roles where we might ask for a degree, but also open the door to someone who has equivalent experience. And there are roles where we say we would prefer it if you have that degree, but we are very happy to hire someone. A prime example is we are currently in the recruitment process for an artificial intelligence librarian, where we do not require an MLS degree. And I heard externally at least one person when I posted this who felt that this was not a librarian role and we shouldn't call it that way. I feel differently. I know that when we find the right person, they will have a tremendous impact in this library, working as a librarian with our colleagues, and I would like them to be recognized as such. And I also wanted to deliberately send a signal that artificial intelligence is something that librarians do, and having the ability to do that is also important, and therefore we decided not to require or request a librarian degree. The final point that I also want to make is the university values freedom of expression. It also really values diversity of thought. And what we have good data on is that the more requirements we put up for degrees, the smaller the pool is of applicants that we can get. And if we want to have a staff that reflects that diversity of thought that we're looking for, then we should find ways of bringing people into the profession. And we are now in the position where we can again support our colleagues here to go and study at library school. And I'd much rather at the moment bring someone who has artificial intelligence expertise into a library. And if that's a suitable choice for them to make, then maybe support them to get such a degree, or for them to work with other librarians and learn the skills that they need to do, instead of taking the risk of not filling this position and preventing the library from sort of being at the cutting edge of supporting artificial intelligence in this university, which is absolutely where we need to be.
We've perhaps inevitably reached the, the topic of AI. You said, I think, very presciently in 2018, which is probably the stone age for AI. How long will it be before Siri and Alexa will be able to respond to specific detailed research questions? And you mentioned sort of a research topic. Well, that's come true with Gen AI, surely.
It has to an extent. And when I was thinking about this, what I'm in some ways very much had in mind is that I felt it wouldn't be too long until we have digital assistants that we would go to and ask questions, and they would then go and pull the information from libraries, and that we would ultimately, or the technology companies would ultimately become an interface between us and our users. That really concerned me. I think it was in 2019 or 2020 when I gave a talk at the Research Libraries UK conference on what a research library could look like in 2030. And I'm not normally one for prophecy, but one of the prophecies that I made is that commercially run AI systems will intersect themselves between us and our users. We now see this happen. I just learned from some of the research that was done into the outcome of the recent German election that younger voters did not just use TikTok. They also increasingly went to the AI tool of their trust and said, effectively, which party should I vote for, or what are the positions of those parties? Sometimes from what I learned from one piece, this seemed to come with the idea that all the people who just use one newspaper get biased, whereas the AI tool knows everything online and will therefore give unbiased view. Now, anyone who's looked into generative AI knows that couldn't be further from the truth. But it's true that at some point, the library catalog was the start of the research. Then Google and Wikipedia became the start of the research. now it's increasingly social media, and also to an extent, at least some of the generative AI tools. That really concerns me, because it means if this is the starting point, or for some people even the end of a journey on acquiring knowledge, then as a society, we become dependent on the quality of the algorithm, the way how it's trained, and the data sources that go into it. And if we're not careful, will give new generation the view that this is objective knowledge, and it would be objective knowledge controlled by one company. I find that frightening. And so what we, I think, need to make sure is that we that we enable not just younger people, but I think in particular for the future generation, to understand at least the basic principles about how these tools work, what you can and cannot get, and that we find other ways of exposing the content and the knowledge that we have and make them as visible as possible in this space, and try not to ultimately disappear behind a small number of companies that will control access to knowledge. That will also, I think, require a wider, ideally global debate on how we want to regulate and govern society. And I feel there's a bit of a responsibility for us to raise that concern. In my particular role, together with faculty, engage with students, but also engage publicly, and ask the question about what we think the future of knowledge is, and if we think a small number of companies should really control this. And if you look at social media now, you will see that one, maybe two handful of companies control a significant amount, not just of public discourse, but also of content that's been created in the last 10 or 20 years. If Google were to switch off YouTube today because they feel it wouldn't make them money, the amount of scholarly material, but also just culture that would disappear in one go is staggering. In the past, we had a distributed system where anything that was popular would be available. There would be monks copying material and sending it around, and if one library burns down and one manuscript is lost and an area was devastated by war, there was at least a good chance material would survive somewhere else. In the digital world, if something like Google or Twitter were to go, only a very small subset of that content would survive, even if it was very popular. So I think as a society, we have a few key questions to ask about what we want to preserve, what access we want to ensure is there beyond commercial interests, and how we regulate and use AI to prevent that kind of future. At least I would like to make a case that we should prevent that kind of future, that it should be more broadened and it should be more transparent, and more accessible. And that is a core role for libraries that I think needs to influence everything and how we approach artificial intelligence. But staying away from it, or just saying that we're not supporting it, we might want to ban it or anything like this, with the exception of maybe some very well considered specific cases, otherwise does not strike me like a good solution.
Well, I feel it's quite reassuring to know that there's at least one library where there's where there's a thought being taken to on the best use and the most effective way to implement AI. So I think on that note, an optimistic note, I'd like to end the talk with you. Thank you very much, Torsten, for your invaluable, fascinating insights into your career and your role. I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.